yoga now is a lot more popular, let's say, in the West than in itself.
Than India?
Than India. I don't know how many...
I think actually, the modern market now for yoga has really come to India. I mean, I'd say if you know, from a business-minded perspective, I'd say getting into the Indian market now as a yoga teacher, because it's exploding massively here, massive. But, you know, it's a modern phenomenon. The way that they're doing yoga now, and they often say asana or asana. If you have a long A, then it's traditional asana. And the long A in the traditional pronunciation is to do with, a few asanas, puja, all the, the traditional way that your grandma would do yoga in India, And the asana, is a westernized version that's come back, the pizza effect, that's gone out and come back as a whole new package. And they're super interested in it. It's on every corner now. I'd say a bigger market than anywhere else. Because, I think that there's certain tendencies that I think I would see general patterns to my Indian students that I taught in London, that they're somewhat better suited than many of the Western bodies, let's say, to doing the asana system in the first place, right? It's taken up massively. And it's on the wane in the West in a certain sense. I think that what we call yoga in the West now, sometimes you get to a class and you kind of recognize it almost from a kind of aerobics HIIT workout, It's an interesting time, and I think to see how yoga is going to develop in India now is going to be an interesting conversation. From talking to people like Sharan or other Sujata or other Indian students that I know, what's happening here is really interesting to see how it goes forward, right? Yeah.
How would you explain that it's still very much dominated by females? I mean, if you look around.
Yeah.
Whereas if I see the pictures,
there are a lot of men there, totally, yeah. That's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I think I'll leave it to you as a cultural phenomenon why that's happened. I mean, I think, that... But the early days, there were a lot of men. Yeah. So where did the women come in? Yeah, you don't want to be cynical, but,
I can't explain myself. I thought, okay, maybe it's spiritual and it's a more feminine quality, but it's a very physical practice that you could also fit in a masculine mindset. So.
Yeah. I think there were a lot. And when I was starting it in the late 90s, it was much more 50-50, or even more men than women, I have to say. And something shifted without me even noticing it along the way. And I think probably that was that men just went off to do calisthenics and gym more, probably. Yeah, it's something to think about, but certainly the trend, increasingly so, was, as I say, I remember clearly my classes in the early days when I was learning it was more 50-50 guys and women, I'd say. Yeah.
I don't really know what I'm trying to ask, maybe it's just a thought.
Yeah.
I feel sometimes like going through this and more recently realised history of not necessarily just Canada, but I suppose other schools of yoga as well, can be a bit depressing in a way, because it almost seems like a lot of the teachings have maybe progressed over time on the basis of like financial or business motive rather than necessarily coming from like the spiritual side of things, which I guess when you think of yoga, that's like what you think of as a more traditional view. I don't know if you have any thoughts on like why are we doing this? Like what's the purpose? Whenever it just seems like sometimes it could be more of like a gymnastic than necessarily like that.
Well, partly,
Can you repeat the question?
I'm going to try and talk around the question and you'll get it from the answer, because the question is loosely contextualized, but I kind of get the gist of it, I think. Well, first of all, I want to say is that you know, I know it's a cliche, but intention changes everything. You know, one could have an intention towards anything and make anything, you know, symbolic or spiritual. It's, you know, just a question of how you use a ritual. Anything could be a ritual, you know. Ritual spaces are the basis of any religion. You do something specifically, you concentrate your mind in a certain action every day, and you take the motive away. And once you take the motive of action away, you're doing X to get Y, then you're resting in the space of consciousness, because you're doing something for no reason now. And when you're doing an action for no reason, but you're still doing it consciously, that begs the question, and that also throws your consciousness back on yourself, rather than looking for an answer or solution in the action, you see. So ritual action is profound, it is sacred. Yep. So the intention is part of it, but that doesn't fully answer your question, which is somewhat, let's say, there's an element of disillusionment there. I think anything that survives has to be monetized now, because otherwise, it wouldn't survive in the modern context. You know, one of the reasons for the lead class is, of course, that no one can afford to pay for a one-to-one. So you've got, homogenized systems, because that's the way that people can survive, because you need numbers as a yoga teacher to survive. Does that make it inauthentic? I don't necessarily think so. I'm more pragmatic than that. I mean, I think that the teachings themselves, if you look to the way that Pattabhi Jois was teaching and Krishnamacharya, they were still, when you listen to them talk and when you hear early explanations of the posture, they're still very much trying to teach Hatha Yoga as a method of physical transformation using the energy of the spine. So I don't think that's necessarily changed. I mean, I think that obviously some people have made it more, it's been turned in some respects as an exotic fitness kind of regime, but I mean, doesn't inherently have to be treated that way. And I think that the kernel of the method itself, being spinal energy work, I mean, it's there for anyone in any class. If you understand what you want to be doing with it, if you understand the way you want to be stretching, then you make it significant. But of course, you can, even in an Ashtanga class or Vinyasa class, stretch in such a way that you're just stretching, or if you're doing something which is exerting pressure, like I've mentioned many times, then you do exert pressure on your nervous system. And as I mentioned the other day, I think it's Tatiana, I mean, there's two ideas about pressure on the nervous system. One, you're stimulating an energy which is said to be from the kundalini, and it comes up the spine. And another modern science, the idea that you've got the cerebral spinal fluid and it talks constantly to the amygdala, your ancient brain. And if you stimulate the spine enough, it causes a blockage of this communication, a brief blockage, and then it gives you time to reset, because you've not got the constant conditioning reaffirmed to you. So if you think about your synaptic loops and trying to break patterns, and your synaptic loops fire so quickly, but if you could block that reaction, then you can think again and make new synaptic loops. So this idea of deconditioning with yoga through the physical process of breaking the relationship between spinal fluid and brain is there and increasingly researched upon as well. And you can do that, just because people are using it to make money and to sell stuff doesn't mean that the method itself doesn't hold water still. But I think if it's going to be, the whole popularization obviously comes with, inevitably, with that people have to make a living, and it wouldn't be here, I think, if it wasn't a viable commodity. I don't think we would ever, had it outside the yogis in the Himalayas. It never would have traveled outside that, I mean, we have to remember, in the first place, Krishnamacharya was paid to teach those boys, right? That was a job, He was given that job when he was a coffee plantation farmer, spending weeks away in a coffee plantation, not doing anything that he was trained for, because he had 8 kids. And then Maharaja Mysore says, hey, mate, there's all these kids in the Mysore palace, like, I'll give you a wage, and you can just teach, in your local town, and, there's commercial interest in everything. Maybe he wouldn't have taught that. I mean, certainly we have to remember that when Krishnamacharya stops teaching the palace, he never teaches anything like that dynamic. So maybe that was also somewhat to do with the fact that he needed work, right? And here were the kids, and he taught them accordingly to the way that he was asked. He's given a job. And then when he taught for himself, he was teaching something very different. But, it still bears water that the methods, if you look at tantric texts and you look at what they're describing in terms of the central channel and balancing the nerves around the center, and you look at the way that Patabi Joyce is speaking in his early videos, and you look at the Makaranda and what Krishnamacharya is talking about, they're still mentioning it. So it's not like they've just completely jumped ship and just, you know, made up something new for the sake of a quick bit of cash. Yeah. BKS Iyengar learnt from Krishnamacharya. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing with Iyengar is that, you know, no one really knows how long he studied with Krishnamacharya. I mean, a lot of the text that that I read with interviewing BKS Iyengar, he suggests, Iyengar this is, that he only ever had 2 lessons with Krishnamacharya. Yeah. Where Patabi Joyce would say that he taught BKS Iyengar, which is Iyengar would dispute. So there's so much uncertainty around this. But when we look at old footage, some of you might have seen, and you can see this very clearly on YouTube. You've got Iyengar BKS doing sequences with Krishnamacharya that look very much like Ashtanga sequences. They're not the same order again, but they're jumping forward and back into postures. They're kind of Ashtanga-like, yeah? But Iyengar says that the Krishnamacharya didn't really give him, he gave him 2 lessons in his life, and mainly he was taught by a couple of the other boys that Krishnamacharya taught. And then, very early on, Iyengar obviously goes off to Pune and he makes up his own Iyengar yoga system, which is almost Iyengar yoga, we have to say, is a kind of reaction against Ashtanga and a kind of a reaction against Krishnamacharya, really, because Iyengar and Krishnamacharya had a very fractious relationship. He was always going to be called, Iyengar always called Krishnamacharya his guru because, of course, he was the person who taught him, and that's very important in India to respect your teacher. But he didn't get on with Krishnamacharya at all and didn't agree with most of what he got taught there. And he was also injured very badly by Krishnamacharya, who famously pushed him in the splits posture and tore one of his hamstrings in a demonstration. Yeah. There's a funny story where BKS Iyengar's wearing tight shorts and he says, I can't do the splits. There's a nobility that often happens. And someone comes out of town and Krishnamacharya is called on to give a yoga demonstration. Maharaja Mysore, Krishnamacharya, do the demonstration, bring the boys. Iyengar's there. So Krishnamacharya gets to Iyengar, says, do Hanumanasana. And Iyengar doesn't want to do it. He can't do the splits. He says, my shorts are too tight. I can't do the shorts. So the Krishnamacharya says, get a knife. Someone get a knife. So they cut his shorts, not his body. They cut his shorts and they make him do the splits and he tears his hamstrings. And so, there's many, the reaction of Iyengar yoga and his litigiousness for detail and care is really a lot, I think, a reaction against the way that he learnt originally with Krishnamacharya. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
When you did the interest in yoga anatomy or
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, that yoga anatomy stuff was really a modern thing. I mean, when I started learning, no one had heard of anything. We just kind of thought, if you got pushed enough and let go into an adjustment, your body would open. But of course, we're a fairly short window. That was like 20-something years, and as we've gone on, we've kind of increasingly, we hope, some of us have realized that adjusting a body like that doesn't work. And in the recent years, the scientific discoveries have found that you actually don't stretch muscles at all, that muscles don't stretch, they always remain the same length, and the tension is in the mental holding. And so people have brought in yoga anatomy from the 2000s. I mean, someone like Richard Freeman, who was kind of a Iyengar student originally, brought in a lot more attention to detail from the 90s. And so that started to creep in. But really, I think from the later 2000s, after so many people started getting injured and people started trying to, and also this wish that's been, I think, from the early days to kind of accredit yoga from a Western perspective. So that means to bring in science into yoga, so it's somewhat dubious in a post-colonial thinking that this is yoga. Yoga is bona fide as long as we can accredit it from a Western scientific point of view and align it up from an anatomical point of view. Whereas, of course, it was an energy practice that had nothing to do with yoga anatomy. Right? But I mean, it's not to say that we disqualify anatomy, because, of course, hopefully we think that people learn a little bit about how bodies work and don't just push people into postures and hope for the best so much anymore. But it doesn't seem that that's necessarily necessarily the case. You know, there's all this focus on anatomy these days, but teachers end up going off and doing the same thing, even having learnt all the names of the muscles, doesn't seem to have necessarily done its job. Tom.
Do you think, like, we discussed it a lot at the beginning of the whole most of the teachers just pushing stances, and this is more of a flexibility class. Do you feel like now the thing is changing and like more people are starting to understand yoga in the way like you teach it, or do you?
No, sadly, I don't think so. I mean, I think increasingly maybe not, because if you're thinking about like what's popular on social media, which is kind of like increasingly all that matters, it's an extended big stretch. So the further you stretch out of yourself, the more flexible. So that's why flexibility is rewarded and valued, because it looks great. You know, the more you can do a split or a deeper posture, stretch your limbs further away from each other, that's going to get you, it may get you, many things, right? Not only fame these days, but, you can be a careerist yoga teacher and, right? So I think that, I think that flexibility more than ever is rewarded because it sells. Yeah.
But the reason I'm asking is because the people who started learning in the 70s and 90s, they're older now.
Yeah.
Their bodies aren't as flexible and not as in obesity. So probably if they're keeping up this kind of lifestyle, or if they're getting injured.
Well, actually, those people the early teachers are the teachers that I learnt this from. So actually, it's gone the whole cycle. So they weren't on social media. They didn't even have posture pictures. So they were doing it with rounded backs. They were doing it with tension, with right tension. They were doing postures that didn't look so visually, aesthetically pleasing. But they're fading out now, so their message is being lost. I mean, they're dying. Nancy Gilgoff passed away recently. She was one of the main proponents of do yoga with a rounded back, pull together, don't stretch out of yourself, But that message is being lost, and the younger generation is coming through with visual flexibility stuff and saturating the market. And now, my teacher Darby taught here because he doesn't do social media, he taught here with 6-8 students, and I taught here with all you guys because I'm on social media. So you see, they're less popular now because they're not on the social media, because they kind of retired anyway, and that's not their game, So it's like, you can see, I obviously respect and venerate my teacher way over me, but he's less popular now, maybe even than me, which is a weird turn of events, just because I happen to be on social media. So their message is being lost, sadly. And in place of that, it's being rewarded a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of mainly young women in nice yoga clothes doing postures that look really advanced because they're big. I could do a very advanced posture in a knot or something, and you could see a right tension, but you can't photograph that, So, I think that's the way it's going. And, of course, there's always going to be people that push back against that, but I see less of those and more people that are rewarded by social media, because I have been. So it does reward. I happen to be okay enough with my mouth that I'm able to put out other content. Otherwise, maybe I would, if I wanted to carry on yoga teaching, have to be posting all these stretchy postures all the time just to keep a job. It's an interesting time. Yeah. I had something else to say, but I can't remember exactly. I think.
How does it deepen your practice? What did it do for the practice itself?
Yeah, it's hard to know because you've never got a person who hasn't done it, but I really do. I'm only trying to extrapolate why. I'm always trying to extrapolate why the practice worked to me as it did, and it did have an amazingly healing quality. And so, although I can't guarantee it, when I look at books and I'm trying to look at the tantric language, etc., and I'm seeing something, they're always talking about the spine, and I'm assuming that there's ability. The original tantric precedent is the Kundalini precedent, right? You're awakening this energy, But I'm a believer that there is something in the body-mind connection which, through physical work, can be appeased or can be somewhat resolved, and then that maybe when that process is somewhat gone through, then there's also a possibility to return to those questions again with maybe in a calm and less desperate manner, because I think when I approached them when I was young, it was really out of desperation. There was no sense of groundedness. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely a period, I think it can happen to us all in our own work, where you get invested in your career and you forget maybe why you started it in the first place. And that certainly happened to me in many of those years in Mysore doing the advanced gymnastics. Doesn't have to, but I think it's probably, you know, letting myself off the hook somewhat, an easy trap to get into. And when the distraction of the asana isn't there so much in a certain sense, I think then the questions, you're more free to ask the questions. The other thing I was going to say is that with the practice and pushing, you can see the questions are always there for us all, I think. Whether we believe that we're a philosopher or not, I think we all are. We're all asking the same questions about life. We just ask them in different ways. And when we're thinking about what we want and what we desire, it's the same old question. You know, in the end, underneath everything, it's the question of meaning. You know, who am I and what's my purpose in life? What's it for? Yeah. And I think we cover it over all the time, seeking what we want and trying to avoid what we don't want. But underneath that, I believe in all of us, that same question is there. And I think that the yoga practice, this one as well, and I think I did this, it can be used to put a lid on that question, because it's so demanding and it's so invigorating that it can easily quash that question. And I think there was a certain point in my life, in my early 20s, when the question was too much to be functioning in a sensible way in society, and it was probably good to put a lid on that and quash that. But at a certain point, I think and many people, I think, and maybe some of my contemporaries, now we're not recording, have kept quashing that question, and I think that at a certain point you need to let the question out again. And I think that this practice, being so demanding and somewhat depleting if practiced intensely, can almost numb the question or cover over the question. Oh, I've just done my practice and everything is okay, you know. So I think it's always a balance, you know. These feelings of dissatisfaction, even anxiety, even depression to a certain extent, they're valid feelings and they're part of being alive, and we need them to try and seek meaning and to keep seeking meaning, right? Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah.
Adam, what's your take on the other limbs? So, of course, we touched on the yoga that we practice, and of course, see that this is coming from the school.
No, I mean that's the name is a conflation. Yeah. Then the Sharan's question is, what about the other limbs? How do they fit in? Well, the conflation is that, you know, it's only recently.
And the other part is, what's your personal, after so many years, like from now?
Yeah.
Do you include the other limbs? Is that something that you do and advise us to do? That's the question.
Right. That is a difficult question, not one that I love, that I enjoy answering. It's a good question, but right. So my feeling is that this practice doesn't come from the classical school of yoga, it comes from the tantric school. More recently, I mean, when those early, not to say it couldn't be somewhat fused together, but it is a grafting. It is a grafting of two different schools together. And somewhat Krishnamacharya did it himself. When you read Makaranda, you should definitely download the PDF of Yoga Makaranda. All of you, if you haven't read it, it's free. Get it, read it. Krishnamacharya's thoughts on yoga. And you can see what he does. It's a very clever thing in the start of the 20th century. He kind of gets the tantric stuff about energy work in the body, and he gets Patanjali, and he also gets Ayurvedic cures, like curing like health problems. And he kind of fuses all these together in a kind of, in a way that's quite genius, really, you know, in his work, right? But they are originally, in pre-Krishnamacharya, different schools. Patanjali was really talking about meditation, and when he was talking about yamas and niyamas, well, it's a monastic text, really. That's my view, and it's not just my view, but that essentially those yamas and niyamas, they can only really be lived as a monk. When you're looking at living in the world, you're really looking at something like the Bhagavad Gita, in which case ahimsa is unavoidable. That's the first point of the Bhagavad Gita. The first chapter is you've got a civil war. And actually Krishna is encouraging Arjuna to go out and kill people in it, right? So there's somewhat the take of the kind of rather saccharine use of the yamas, niyamas in the modern take is maybe ill-considered because they were for monastics. And secondly, the Ashtanga Yoga as an appendage to Pattabhi Joyce's yoga was a more recent addition. I think up until the late 80s, early 90s, they just called it the yoga. It wasn't called Ashtanga Yoga, and Krishnamacharya didn't call what he taught those boys in the Mysore Palace Ashtanga Yoga. He taught it Yoga Karunta. Yeah, he called it Yoga Karunta.